Good to see you, sir.
I'm streaming. Oh, Logan's there. Hi, Logan.
There's two people. I don't know who they are. What's the reason you wanted this?
No, I just was going.
I want to say that
This is the first time.
yeah.
Au revoir. Is it the first time you see you this year? Yeah, it might be the first time I see you this year. I mean,
What is up? What is up? What is up? What is up? Are you guys all right? That's great. Okay, so first, apologies because we were supposed to have the wonderful family sitting here, but we couldn't make it happen. Like a last minute. So I have stepped in, so basically tuned in, so keep quiet. So once again, it is. But I'm actually surprised that other people are here. But yeah, what I started doing is kind of reading from chapter from the book that might be coming out. It's still definitely questionable whether that's going to happen, but it's called The End of Supplication, um, the Invention of Prostrate Blackness, and as a replacement for the Maroon. And basically, it is about um, the training of Black people into a type of prostrated position when it comes to the law, the state, etc., and how that has been affected in a number of different ways. So this is actually from the last chapter, and I'm just going to read until I get tired, and then after that we'll have an extremely informal conversation, and everybody can just say chime in as you wish. All right?
Prostrate means lying on your stomach.
Yeah, I mean it's really about the position, almost an emotional position that you're put in, where it's literally like people could be prostrated like you're doing a type of worship. So you're on your knees and your hands are extended, or you could just be like lying down prostrate. But it's really just a gesture of submission to whatever power you're prostrated to. The afternoon of the not guilty on all counts verdict in Kyle Rittenhouse's trial for fatally shooting two protesters during the 2020 uprising for Black Lives that spread to Kenosha, Wisconsin. Chris Hayes, host of the In with Chris Hayes primetime evening news program on MSNBC, the liberal counter to the white nationalist Fox News, as it happens the most watched news channel in the colony, tweeted, "Honestly, hope that kid takes the opportunity to turn his life around and tries to make the world a better place, rather than pursuing the George Zimmerman, which is the killer of Trayvon Martin, life trajectory." Hayes, interestingly enough, is not otherwise given to fanciful hope. He once called moderate Republican Senator Susan Collins hope that President Trump would change course after learning from his first impeachment manifestly absurd. But for the alleged white power sign flashing Kyle Rittenhouse, it seemed for Hayes too, hope springs eternal. Chris Hayes' hope in Kyle Rittenhouse and the white liberals' perpetual hope in the coming around of racist American society is costly, and it is a price their victims are required to pay. One can hope that a man who killed people protesting in support of ending police murder of black people might turn his life around. One might brush aside the flash white power sign, the rallying up and emboldening of individuals on the side of killing protesters, of sitting down with giddy, congratulatory white nationalist youth personalities and politicians. One might put away the girthy, hot-breathed history of white nationalist mob violence against black people fighting for their lives and say, I hope he understands he did something terrible and seeks forgiveness. But what is waged in the gamble is black life. If you are wrong, all that is lost are more of the traditional targets of white supremacist violence, black people especially. It is not only the killers who believe black life is disposable. Black liberation theologian by James Cone identified the white liberals' patience with cruelty. In 1978, anti-apartheid thinker Steve Biko put it as follows. First, the black-white circles are almost always a creation of white liberals. As a testimony to their claim of complete identification with the blacks, they call a few intelligent and articulate blacks to come around for tea at home, where all present asked each other the same old hackneyed question: how can we bring about change in South Africa? The more such tea parties one calls, the more of a liberal he is, and the freer he shall feel from the guilt that harnesses and binds his conscience. Hence, he moves around his white circles, whites-only hotels, beaches, restaurants, and cinemas, with a lighter load, feeling that he is not like the rest of the others. Yet at the back of his mind is a constant reminder that he is quite comfortable as things stand, and therefore should not bother about change. Although he does not vote for the National Party, which is the party in South Africa, the Boer Party, now that they are in the majority anyway, he feels quite secure under the protection offered by the Nats and subconsciously shuns the idea of a change. This is what demarcates the liberal from the black world. The liberals feel the oppressive view. From time to time, the liberal makes themselves forget about the problem or take their eyes off the eyesore. On the other hand, in oppression, the blacks are experiencing a situation from which they are unable to escape at any given moment. Theirs is a struggle to get out of the situation and not merely to solve a peripheral problem, as in the case of the liberals. This is why blacks speak with a greater sense of urgency than whites, end quote. There is no scarcity of cable news hosts, stenographers of liberal sentiment, comfortable behind their news desks beside the smiling, articulate black liberal expert guest, ready to ask in full urgency, how can we bring about change in America? Who do not vote for the Nationalist Populist Party, but are certain that the tragedies and senseless violence will forever far be removed from their door. Who could look at the fatigue-wearing volunteer, auxiliary force self-appointed to patrol the riotous blacks who killed 2 people, but see a baby-faced kid, Kyle, who could turn his life around. Of course, it makes no more sense to hope that Hayes will turn his life around either, or that he might book radical black activists and participants in the uprising, instead of the black liberal preachers and academics invited to explain them, who are prepared to minister and soothe, extinguishing the anger of the revolt with the banter of the baritone of a faithful servant. Or that Rachel Maddow will, and turn away from the morning how racial justice seems always just out of reach for our country, nightly. No hope in MSNBC or CNN or the other American liberal cable news channels, or in leftist congresspeople. Indeed, it makes no sense to hope in those privileged enough to referee debate on the pattern of racial violence, but need not speak with any urgency. Even as the crystal knot of our everyday has spread out from the native quarters and now invaded the private residence of the fortified Speaker of the House, even amidst declarations of intention to arrest the media, the liberal media is incapable of seeing anti-black oppression as anything more than an eyesore spoiling the beautiful view of our country. It is as if they are structurally incapable of understanding, despite that bulging quote on their screensaver, warning that if they come for us in the morning, they will come for you that night. It is a mistake to share in hope with those who can afford to be wrong, even with those who cannot. Like that segment of still hopeful black people trained to wait on equality who have been waiting for centuries, watching entire nations rise and disintegrate while they wither hat in hand at the door of settler colonialism. A door leading to, as even the greatest of mustachioed baby-faced hopers suspected, a burning house. Hope, once an ally to strugglers everywhere, has been cheapened in such hands, beaten to a pulp, watered down, shopped around, and too quick to declare, if not mission accomplished, then is this a turning point? And every mild adjustment in colonial administrative practice. Hope within colonialism has died, and its killers walk around with impunity. On May 28th, the second night of the 2020 uprising launched from Minneapolis. After the death of George Floyd, MSNBC's Rachel Maddow, a program immediately following Chris Hayes' All In, spoke directly to her audience. She informed them that the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Fry, is trying to hold the city together as the whole country looks at Minneapolis tonight, basically just holding our breath. Of course, the we, said to be holding our breath, was not the colonized watching in anti-colonial hope that the society that regularized the arbitrary killing of black people would be somewhat gutted. It is not those worried about the damage the violence of a revolt in the colony might mean for property and order. The perspective is not the perspective of all. It was not the perspectives of those rising against master society. It is this perspective of the white liberal audience that is so easily fitted with the term we, because the black and suffering and radical are unspeaking animals in white liberal thought, only to be seen prostrated and not to be heard save and plead. The we, the national we, is the settler we, a we that seeks to nationalize the colonized denizens into settler citizenship, all the while speaking from the position of onlooker rather than oppressed. The we of the imagined community reading in horror about the slave revolt in their newspapers, not the we chased down by the slave hunt. The department store window smashing we. No anti-colonialist was holding their breath for the safety of the plantation. None joined police and mayor's press conferences in tears asking, we sick. In a state governed by Amy Klobuchar, elected to Congress like most Democrats and all conservatives, through a promise to expand and fortify some of the most discriminatory institutions in human history, i.e. U.S. laws and prisons. A governor who, like other Democrat moderates like Pete Buttigieg, Kamala Harris, and Michael Bloomberg, suddenly found themselves in the nude as the uprising made pride in the records of supporting the institutions of black harm a liability overnight. An uprising so impactful that the intellectual space it opened up produced a brief 4 years reprieve from lynch mob society's onward march to take back the state apparatus. When did Kamala Harris and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz's presidential campaign spectacularly fail to extend, despite its unending overtures to American Nazism and attempts to tempt attendees of the Trump campaign's pre-election race rally in Madison Square Garden away from Trumpism with promises of shared government and Dick and Liz Cheney. As the urban cane fields of Minnesota burned, Maddow had the city's mayor on for an interview. He had apparently memorized college students' talking points about institutionalized racism and could drop points about racial restrictive covenants and 400 years of anti-black oppression at will, using the familiar, disingenuously earnest tone as if it was a progressive stump speech. But he did not camouflage the fact that although he intended to let the community express righteous anger and sadness that the looting must stop, that is, that he was engaged in the management of social unrest, using the policing tactic of opening a release valve by letting the oppressed express their temper tantrum for a while, burn a few things, until they tire themselves out and we fall back into the regular order of unprotested police murders, or what the colony calls peace. Maddow invited the mayor to speak, not the bowels of the colonial prison, nor the black lumber proletariat in the streets who are less unheard than they are uninvited. I expected no guests brought on the Racial Matter show that would ask why those like MSNBC, who were putatively for social justice, would be holding their breath when social justice was attempted to be taken after it had been wrongly refused. Or ask why would we all hold our breath at the anger brought on after a public suffocation. The relieved, excited, cautiously optimistic, pleased, vengeful, who finally, after so long a time, could luxuriate on this likely brief moment of allowed exhalation, is never invited to a sit down on colonialist media. And if the colonized were, and explained that we are all enjoying a useful response to necrophobic police sport killing, not only would our we not be recognized, but we would politely be invited to offset. The white abolitionist we never includes the insurrectionist slave. The liberals we does not include those angry at black suffering, and those who express black outrage must have it nullified by colonialist hope and a path towards forgiveness, reconciliation, and the racist peace. In a podcast interview, what the 1960s can teach us about modern day protests, this is in 2020, published at the outbreak of the uprising, PBS's Harry Srinivasan conducted with Omar Waza included the following exchange. Omar, what I see in the 1960s is that counties that were near nonviolent protests vote more in the coalition that is aligned with black interests. At the same time, what I also see is that counties that are close to violent protests vote more conservatively. HS. So what we see, so when we see peaceful protests, we respond in a way that speaks about human rights and civil rights. When we see violent protests or riots, we respond in a way that wants more law and order. Is that roughly, am I summarizing it correctly? Yeah, I think that was a very good summary. Let's leave aside whether the violent protests they speak of include violence against property, and the specialist conclusion that the violence in protests is what leads counties to vote conservatively. Who are the we who respond to the protesters? The we who see the protests and then want more law and order. It is certainly not the protesters. Maddo and Srinivasan's we who sees is a we with a view from the voting public. The public that has historically not invited the black proletariat to political power, much less to speak. The protesters are the objects, a part of the event that is occurring. The voters and the onlookers are the subjects. From this position, they are able to warn black people without explicitly warning them that although people sympathize with the horrific video of the killing of George Floyd, their patience will run out. It is the settler we which is deployed to discipline black uprisings, to encourage peaceful, that is to say, not effective, protest. And as if an official branch of police power, to warn that the white public will only be sympathetic to rebellious blacks for so long. The colonized is not included in the we who sees, who votes, who is public. And yet the colonizing we, the we that is given political prerogative, is considered a we that is diverse. And when the door of the colonized we is open, it is the we of the pleading and forgiving peaceful blackness who are invited in, not the revolting we, which seeks to replace. It is the we of the black politicians somberly affirming we know Joe Biden. Professors and pastors who serve as the uncles and aunties, the good slave of the slaveholder's imagination, are brought onto television programs to offer comfort to liberal news anchors. Part native informants, part spinners, representing the black anti-colonial revolt as a civil rights pleading. They are there to displace and remove the voice box of the black uprising. The revolt's we is barred from entry from the colonist we, even as colonialism forcibly reminds us that progress has been made in terms of representation. The colonist we disciplines. It is the we of we are a nation of laws, and leaving the sidewalks during a protest is un-American. It always it always to be unintentionally revealed that they imagine we to include only those who look at the cotton fields from their window. The black liberal expert guest in the doorway, balancing the tea service set. The figure of the supplicating slave displaces the revolt. Black radical thought is occupied in public by the platforming of the radically token. The colonial world is a world in which the object of the blacks is represented, proliferate, ubiquitous in the society of white supremacist spectacle, but the black, non-compliant, and anti-colonial thought remains uninvited. In the colony, black humanity is not the black expected to come to tea. In the heat of the night of revolt, when stores were burning and riot police were deployed to contain the uprising against pleasure killing and general white supremacist impunity on display, in the recorded slow murder of George Floyd a month earlier, Senator Cory Booker stepped out and delivered a speech. It included the lines, "It's why so many black Americans scream, 'Do you see me? I do not have your equal justice under the law. Do you see me? I matter. I matter. Black lives matter. Black bodies matter. America, I love you. Do you see me? Do you know our experiences? Do you see the failings of our ideals?" Although not nearly as iconic and impactful as the speeches of Martin Luther King and others examined in the previous chapter, it is still important to reflect upon here. It is almost a too perfect representation of the liberals stamping out the slave revolt and placing it in instead the ventriloquizing of the supplicant Negro. I find this speech to be horrific. To transform the memories of the dead and injured into puppets of supplication to the colonial state, turning still warm corpses into the Emancipation Memorial statue on Capitol Hill, the kneeling naked slave being petted by the great emancipator, President Lincoln. To speechify on Black death and exclude so perfectly Black people from the intended audience. To perform the worst cliches of liberal race cinema, to win the hearts of Congresspeople so dedicated to white supremacy that they would defend its officiate no matter how ridiculous a person. The dullness of the senator's poetics is a perfect complement to the fecklessness of all proposed progressive reforms. It showcases how base and empty is a position of pleading with the political enemies of Black freedom. That it is the result either of a deep callousness, interested in performing the Black spokesman for the people for political clout, with no expectation of radical reform, or an earnest plea and belief that radical reform might be won after a speech testifying that the killed Blacks love America. It is as if he believes that politicians in both houses who have supported a white supremacist president and pushed laws to reducing voting and life chances of Black people were in fact genuinely committed to ideals of liberty for all and could be moved by film slaughter and a heart-tugging speech into dropping racism at the door and making a change. A belief that could only come about by a deep disinterest in the history of Black life in white supremacist society and the rush to give white supremacists the benefit of the doubt. The senator channeled the supplicant Negro figure in his speech to help neutralize the uprising and recenter the moribund campaign for equal rights and policy change for Black people in colonialism. It was a stone's throw away from Van Jones' lucrative performance crime and comforting white people during a people's uprising for Black life. Not that the senator would ever throw a stone. I used to work in Newark, New Jersey, where Cory Booker was mayor. I was a frequent visitor to many of his most exploited native portions. Never once have I heard anyone crying out, "America, I love you, do you see me?" Nor anything or any action that would justify such a plea skywritten over the native portraits of Newark or any other city. None of us are bound by so soiled a straitjacket. Big Sam, Uncle Tom, Twain's Jim, Prissy, and any such huggable dotards never existed, no matter how often Black liberal politicians, colonial explorers, white abolitionists, Klansmen novelists, and news anchors will them into existence. There is no mass of colonized anywhere who would elect to have their memory desecrated like this, and, after being murdered by a colonial agent, would rest peacefully knowing that their corpse was made to beg colonialism to be seen. It does not matter if the colonized, the Black working proletariat, love America or not. Fealty to the state is not the slave pass they must present on demand in order to keep their life. George Floyd does not need to be converted into a cherubim looking down on us, as former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi prayed, a minstrel cherubim guiding the Democrats' reform bill. He can be a complex human being, an informal market hustler, a survivor of anti-black colonial life. He must not be forced, without his consent, into a smiling, peaceable Uncle Tom figure shining down from heaven after sacrificing his life for justice. The conservative attempt to push back on the swell of the uprising with the usual tar and feathering of the black corpse, intimidated by the display of global sympathy for black people, could not state as forcefully at the beginning, as they did from Mike Brown, Trayvon Martin, and Ahmaud Arbery, that they were criminal thugs who deserved their death. A softening of the language was detectable, despite no change in meaning. A phrase that began to be heard was that people should select a different martyr for their cause than George Floyd, who was a bad person and was no angel. In fear of traction, George Floyd forced into supplicating figure in the world. Conservatives, just as pro-slavery advocates, pushed anti-Talmud literature to counter the traction and abolitionist threat of Stowe's novel, designed an alternative image of Floyd as petty criminal, non-compliant, a police resistor that did not deserve canonization. But I can be no angel. I can dress like Tom Sawyer and trespass on construction sites while black. I can fight my stalker. I can pay with a counterfeit bill. I can be armed. I can be guilty of crimes. The colonist does not have any God-given right to kill me. I have no obligation to obey any human being, ever. I am militantly free. I am maroon free. In life, in death, in afterlife. In my body, in its conduct, its expression, my freedom is absolute. In every plane of existence. The figure of the supplicant Negro, drawn directly from white supremacist fantasies, and that bears such a likeness to Booker's description of black people, is foreign to me. Indeed, it cannot exist. The rebels, before execution, asked that their heads be turned to face Africa, not bowed with their heads clasped in prayers for the state. The liberals should keep their hands off the body and memory of the victims of their beloved colonialism.
The liberals should keep their hands off the bodies of who?
Let me see. The liberals should keep their hands off the body and memory of the victims of their beloved colonialism. So keep their hands off the body of the victims of the people who are killed by the same thing that they're about. I'm just ranting after that for quite a while. So, but you basically get the general gist. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Yannick. It's wonderful to hear something that, for you, it sounds like you're still seeing it as a work in progress.
Yeah.
But hearing it, it feels like it's very well thought out. It's quite digested. And there are a couple sort of touch points that I found. Maybe the first you could talk about more is this question of comfort. You've mentioned Martin Luther King really quickly. He's not someone I draw very much inspiration for, but I guess at least once a year, someone trots out, a letter for Birmingham jail, and it's like accusation of the white liberals actually being the problem. And it seems like there's at least one important moment in there where he says, well, the point of nonviolence is not supplication, it's to create tension, right, and discomfort. So where did all the discomfort go?
I've always had a very strange relationship to the sudden appearance of the word comfort when we're talking about politics. Because people just out of nowhere kept on saying that we need to start making people feel uncomfortable. And it happened so universally that I was suspicious that this was like in some way, my most conspiracy-related moments thought that somebody planned this out. They were trying to make people think that instead of taking power, the entire point of political work is to tickle somebody or to make them feel like their socks are wet or something like that. Because discomfort is such an immediately and wild reduction of all possibilities of actual political work against colonialism. So I think that people use these ways of speaking about things in order to contain and arrest the political imagination of radical thought. So this is I was speaking earlier on about resistance. Very often, like in a lot of active circles, people speak about we need to resist this or resist that, and what that excludes is the possibility of offense, of actually not being the resistor anymore, to be put to imagine oneself in a position where the violent justice of Black freedom forces others to have to resist it, rather than we have to resist our own lynching. So these curtailing of the imagination that happens through just language seems to be part of the police apparatus. It is because it's not just that they treat one side of the population through like patriotism. So they will train people to say, okay, well, we're going to love our country, and so we're going to operate in this way. Or we're going to vote, so we're going to operate. But they know the leftists are not really down for that. But they have, it's not that the leftists have just escaped that ideology. They have their own specific activist cultures that are also used to contain them. And resistance and comfort and all these other things seem to be appropriate for us. Just like you won't, Fadad talks about like you have the preachers and the teachers for the capitalist countries. For the colonized countries, you have the butt of the gun and napalm. So it's the same power that wants to be maintained, but you have to have different strokes for different folks. And this is what we get. We get taught that we are not supposed to take things from them. We're supposed to resist them. And no, we should take things from them.
Yeah. I mean, so maybe my follow-up on this was that it's interesting that maybe there are like cycles or waves of things that have sort of been sort of like named. Black Lives Matter, maybe like there's the stuff around Michael Brown, and then it gets sort of reinvigorated around George Floyd. And at least in that sort of First Circuit, it seemed like one really important intervention was the critique of respectability politics.
Mm-hmm.
And namely that, you know, you don't have to say that people are innocent, nor do you have to say that there are deserving or undeserving people of like police violence or, you know, other forms of violence. It seems like the implication of that is to be like, we are dangerous, though people sort of skirted that a little bit.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen as much of this critique of respectability politics lately. So my question is like, where did this go? Do you think that it's shifted or transformed? Has it been contained or managed by some of these people? Or is it just shifted and it's just working in a different register now?
Most likely it's the latter. But I've never really heard it being clearly articulated that the colonizers are dangerous. And for me, that's more important. Because once you have a general, like there is a type of way that the colonizers are dangerous to the state by being just like inherently racially like predisposed to criminality. That is the type of danger that is being professed by the discourse. But there's another danger that is that the presence of the colonized might be the colonizers' undoing. It's not just like, okay, well, they're dangerous because they could commit crimes, but that their presence might itself be like itself the grave diggers of the colonists. And in order for we should be leapfrogging over any type of responsibility politics once you see the colonized from the native sectors be dangerous in the streets, known to be dangerous, and to be a threat to the entire system. Because then it's not about ways to behave and manners and kind of slightly moving away from saying like the things that we're supposed to say, like he was a good boy, he didn't do crimes and all that. And so if the end of respectability politics is saying that we are we don't have to be good boys, we can also be mean. But then basically that means that like we should be killed just because we're mean. that still doesn't solve the problem. We need to be in a situation where the the small, protected, guarded places of settler society is in existential threat by the mere presence of like the people that they've harmed. When you have that situation, it's very unlikely that the conversation becomes anything other than let's lock the windows and the doors, which is very different than a debate that is still happening under terms.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that what's so interesting about this is it seems like the most radical a lot of people are willing to go is the move that you just mentioned, where it's like, okay, the most conservative is we're not a problem, we're not dangerous, we're really innocent here, right? So like, don't worry about us. And so you don't need to treat us so badly. And then the sort of middle ground is well, we're complex people with complex lives, we're capable of good things and bad things. You know, that still seems very much in the realm of like liberal, multiculturalist, like let's figure out a place where we can all agree and compromise. And, you know, where do you see right now some of this like, we are dangerous, we could be dangerous, we could be worse? I mean, there's a chapter I titled in a previous book that I got from some Colombian trans sex workers. And they're like, we're bad, but we could be worse. You know, it's kind of almost like a threat, right? So where do you see that sort of arising in context of like the text?
There was a time when like slave owning families were writing in public newspapers that they cannot sleep at night, that they are worried about their families, that it's probably important to stop slavery so that you consistently don't import these hostile savages into our lands. Um, that it wasn't just so, and in that situation, people were thinking that the entirety, like the college people were thinking that the entirety of the settler population could be dismissed. It like you were living your life as a settler, thinking it wasn't this. I'm going to grab my purse because crime can happen. It was I don't know if the country can stand tomorrow. And that was because there was an entirely different sense where the people who were oppressed weren't interpreted as citizens. They were just the intestine enemies of the society, and you were somehow just prayed and hoped and were guarded with guns to be able to make sure that these people don't get out of the land, because it was likely that a slave revolt would happen. It was likely that if you didn't use enough preachers and enough guns and shows of force, it was likely that the enslaved people would come for you and would burn things down because they kept on doing it and doing it a lot. That is so it's not just talking back to the empire and saying that our protests are bad and we could be worse. Like if your worst is not there, you know your worst when they are locking their doors. If they're not, if the racists are walking freely and walking around, then you have not accomplished the necessary things. You have just somehow kind of engaged in a tit for tat with power. But the thing about the slave revolts is that they didn't even, it wasn't a conversation. They knew just by the position of that class of people who were like just orbiting their homes that I might not make it through the night unless enough people are arranged in a certain positions that there isn't enough. So I don't like. I think that there are like levels to this. There is the liberal that is communicating with the Republican. There is the progressive, and then there is the leftist, and there is the Marxist. But at the end of all of these things, there are people who are not in a debate with the colony at all. That they just cannot even be translated. That they are being in themselves, and when they exist, that is an entire. They would wish that people would come across the line and start saying that we could be worse because they don't know where they are. They just know that they exist and we might be dead because we cannot manage them enough. So that inscrutability and danger of not being in communication with the empire is, if not what radical should be, if radical is not that, then I don't know how it is useful other than a very more forceful liberalism.
That reminds me of a couple things. So, I'm sure you've seen it. Maybe not everyone here has though. there's a Swedish filmmaker who found some old archival footage of sort of like Black Power era stuff and came out with Black Power Mixtape, which is a really nice sort of arrangement of things. And then one of his follow-up films concerning violence is a sort of rereading of Fanon in the context of sort of like a lot of Vietnam War archival footage, but also Rhodesia, which was this, awful European colony in southern Africa that was, the whites eventually just abandoned it. And so there's some settlers who are like at the last moments just trying to stay there and say, oh, we're gonna, try and survive or whatever. And I think they were repeating that very same logic where like, it's pretty dire for them. Yeah. And they're about on the precipice of having to leave. And like, it's such a different situation than we see in a lot of these like movement managers and talking heads on TV. And I'm reminded of this text that circulated during the anti-globalization movement, written by some Italians, I think. They said, they aspire not to be part of this sort of like, multivocal voice of, we're all coming together on the world scene or whatever, which was what some people were saying was the radical left version during anti-globalization. They said they want to be the barbarians at the gates. And they gave themselves two features. They're like, we speak in a language that is like either so crass or like so foreign that the people in the like cosmopolitan metropole, who of course has these colonies and things like that, like either doesn't want to or can't understand them. And they're like, we're fine with that. Like that's the point. We don't want to like cultivate ourselves to the point in which we can have the conversation, because it's like that they would feel they'd already be colonized by doing that. And the other is they act with such like crassness because they hold a different cultural and social code that they get completely pathologized as being dangerous or uncivilized, all these other things. They're like, actually, that's who we are. And we're not going to give it up just to try and like, get voice before the king or the sovereign or whatever. Yeah. And I was like, that's it. I don't know who actually like achieves this very often, but if we look in particular cases, I think you can always find some groups that they're not looking to supplicate themselves for a piece of the pie. Yeah. But instead are in this sort of like absolute outside position. Yeah. And they use that as their lever or as their force rather than trying to give it up. So I'm thinking, you gesture towards maroonage. Tell us more.
Yeah, but even before that, so there is a way of like knowing where the outside is, but not being outside. So there is a way to perform outside, or to even be able to speak in a language and we say, well, you're not going to understand this type of thing. And that is, it understands that there is an outside there, which is extremely useful, but it's still in conversation with the empire. It's not really broken from it. But there is a difference between me as a college professor that is walking down certain alleys, and in certain times you'll find someone who you know just by who they are. That's why they're just general appearance, that you might not be in the same situation. Whereas there are other people who are representatives of that class that will be able to speak to you. And as long as you're speaking to me, I know that I'm in a much safer position than the person who I don't know what they're thinking. Because at some points we might have been in that situation themselves, but we knew that we weren't in conversation with that person that was in our neighborhood, that they were just there. And you know that what you were thinking at that time was very different than what you came when you started to be educated out of your violence. And now I'm kind of remarking upon what could be the outside, how I could be different. So it is that world where it is people we are no longer, we cannot really decipher what they're thinking, or we can't find, or we can't see. Those people are absolutely dangerous to our class. And I think that's what marronage is, that there are a bunch of people who were for a very long time in communication with, if they were in the house, they were in communication with the authorities in the house. But once you leave the house completely, once you ran away and you were a fugitive and you were somewhere in the fields, for the position of the plantation owner, you know that the swamp exists. You know that the places where they all have escaped exist, and they're somewhere in it. But you don't. The danger is you don't know anything about them. They're out of surveillance. They are just a being, and that could at any moment, at any time, attack you and destroy you. That I don't know if it is too late for those of us who have escaped the native sector or the lumber proletariat class and have moved on, that we can ever retain that or approximate that in any way. But I am certain that even in my own life, I am much less dangerous than I was before I had a PhD and before I was in school. Because at that point, I was not entirely sure what was happening in the future. And it could very well have been that it seemed practical to rob or destroy somebody. I wasn't that type of person. I was a book person. That was just like, it was not going to be that. But I can imagine somebody who was less enthused about poetry at that point to be in a situation where I don't have a future beyond this. And I don't know what this person is, but this person and me are almost two entirely different types of beings. And I could do anything to that person. Now I can't. And now that person knows that I can't. But without any communication whatsoever. Like I can represent this environment that I'm coming from in this type of class, but even in representing it and even in being forcefully representing it, it is already a confession that I am not of that class and I'm in conversation with you. So there is a reason to believe that the lumpen proletariat are the only revolutionary class. And the problem is, okay, can you actually organize the lumpen proletariat, or is the moment that you organize them, do they become the working class, the people who are revolutionaries, and no longer the same threat? They just become very educated, angry people. That could be the case, but there is something else that happens outside of everything, and that is the space of the lumpen proletariat, the slums, the forests of the runaway slaves, all these type of people. And they might, at some point, surprise us. Because if they are not in a position where they can surprise us, they're already part of a community.
Yeah, and I think there's so much about figuring out how we learn that's some of it just unlearning.
Yeah.
Especially if it's to be for radical ends. I remember, and this is a long time ago, but back during Occupy, there was a split in the city that I was sort of being part of, because there were these students who didn't want to be in the same group as everyone else because they thought they weren't orderly enough, they weren't staying on task, they weren't like goal-oriented. And I sat them down one day, I was like, look, you can split with your own group or whatever, but realize that you're just trying to expect these people to act like college-educated professionals. It's like, that's not how change is going to work. Nor should we want to live in a society in which everyone's more professionalized, more orderly, more rational, or whatever. Like it's an awful future to imagine for ourselves, right?
Yeah, and it presumes that you, at the end of the day, are right, are the truth, and are the powerful. And so, even in the spaces of organizing, the college kid will definitely be able to, even through the power, and sometimes the people that they are organizing accept it, that through the power of the university itself, that they must know more than us. And so even if the truth is on the side of the people that are unschooled, the mere social power of school will get people to actually be orderly and properly policed.
So I have one last sort of question, and we'll sort of invite other people to participate. It's a little scholarly, so not trying to put too many people off. But you mentioned interpolation, and so there's this sort of classic scene of interpolation that we get that's like quite old now, where you're walking down the street and then you hear what you imagine to be like a police officer, maybe you don't even know that yet, and say, hey, you. And in this sort of like thoughtlessness, thinking that someone's trying to get your attention, you turn around, turns out to be a police officer, and boom, they've already got you in their grasp.
Yeah.
Right? And then maybe what's happening there is that they're like asking you to check your papers, or at least asking you for account for yourself. Who are you? Why are you here? What are you doing? Mm-hmm. And so then there's another one that Nick Mirzov and some other people in visual culture have said, it's sort of like white space, and it's sort of like new updated this, which is where you encounter the police officer or something, but they say keep moving. Mm-hmm. So instead of stopping you to make you account,
Mhm.
So keep moving. There's nothing to see here,
Mhm.
right? So maybe that's the imperative of this sort of like consumerist society. It's like, please go shopping. There might be like some really awful structural things going on here, but just don't stop.
Mhm.
Go shop.
Yeah.
So the one that you mentioned, which is a different interpolation than either one of these, is the we,
Mhm.
which doesn't seem like someone is like telling you what to do.
Mhm.
It's someone is sort of calling up not only themselves, but in this collective identity of you, and me.
Mhm.
Together, we are something. So I'm wondering, like, what do you think is happening in that scene? Like, if you can imagine it in the exact same sort of concrete sense of, you're encountering someone and there's this, command going on, but there's a sort of like hidden logic or a hidden activity that you want you to engage in.
Yeah. So, and for me, that scene would be something like the MSNBC show, where the apparatus of ideology is broadcasted everywhere, and Rachel Maddow says, "We are watching what is happening, um, watching Minnesota burn." And all like kind of holding themselves in trepidation that maybe it will burn. But that we was never the we of the uprising, because the we of the uprising was burning things down. So that is, so the ideological apparatus is interpolating the viewing audience into the nationalist we, but it cannot contain the uprising itself. So in that point, the interpolation has to fail. Um, but there is another thing that happens. Like I remember walking on the street of 125th in Harlem, the main street there, and on more than one occasion, I heard people speak about like if you do this, you get 2 to 5 years in prison. They're just talking about this like just casually. And what has happened is that they associate a certain type of behavior with uh, the arrest and the violence of the police state. But what has happened is that they have now, the way they speak of it seems to betray that they believe it's a natural condition. Like it's almost like a fact of nature. That once this is done, you will get this. Like you do something, and so the forces of reality will conspire to put you in prison. So the actual marks of the different individuals who are responsible for the performances of the court, of the theater, of holding you down, of dragging you into a vehicle and then putting you behind metal, all of these individual acts of violence become blurred. And what happens is that I went to jail. I go to jail. Not that people have harassed you and held you prisoner, but you have something that other has happened. And so you have the person who is the subject to the legal anti-black order is now interpolated as a subject of criminal violence all the time, of police violence all the time. So that they are not, because there are other people who they would do the same act and they would never at all consider that they will be harassed. Something has happened to you for you to actually identify with the we of the police. That we of the police is very different than the we of the viewing the protesters. But there is still an arrest in what can be done, because the reason you don't do that act is because you know that this will, by nature, happen to you. Not that you steal like coffee and then random people will likely like harass you and hurt you and torture you and kidnap you. Like that doesn't occur. It's just that you are going in stealing a coffee. You become on the run or in jail, and that thing that happens to you, that is something that is a device deployed to the native quarter itself, to the colonized sector, in a way that is not, because I don't even know what bourgeois do, but I doubt they're thinking about if you do this, you get 5 to 10. Even if they're doing crimes of like white collar fraud, I don't think they think of it like that. But the people on the street do think of it like that. That means something else is happening to them.
Yeah, and it makes me think of these two things. Like one, if you look at places that are less just totally saturated in law and order, then the question of doing something that does not have an inevitable outcome might have a possible one. but it seems very negotiable.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Maybe even in the same way that we're thinking about this person who shot the healthcare executive, right? Where he's like, well, I bet there are a lot of people on New York City streets if they ask them something like, I didn't see anything.
Exactly.
And there are certain neighborhoods where people just know not to say anything.
Yeah.
There are whole cultures of this, and just to assume X leads to Y
Yeah.
is already ignoring that. And I think that it's been sort of like overly professionalized, but I think people who are like professional protesters or whatever are a little bit more thoughtful about this too. They know that, well, if you do this and someone sees you and they can identify you and they snatch you or they find you from a photograph and that happens, and they say, well, maybe wear a mask.
Yes.
Or don't wear any recognizable clothing.
Yeah.
Or all these other ways that are just like, if you can't be seen, maybe you won't be caught. And so there's like a materialism to it.
Yeah.
It's like if you actually think about how it all works, you can break it down, and it's not nearly as just sort of automatic or natural.
Yeah. Yeah. But at the same time, it's like there are people who cannot be caught. So the act itself might not be, because people say that is he on the run, is he running around and doing things, whatever. But it might just be a tit for tat type of situation. Like maybe you've hurt somebody that I care about, and I've hurt somebody that you care about, and then that's the end of the story. Whatever happens, that has nothing to do with whatever happens. But like it's not so much of an act to do something ethically or politically, but it's just a revenge. Who knows what's happening? We don't know what's going on. Could be a white supremacist that is just like wants to do what they want to do.
But this is like what happened with the Panthers, right? Where like when they had a confrontation with the police, they weren't like, "Oh, you got me," and you sort of hand someone over. I mean, they would start kind of shooting or whatever, and maybe you'd eventually have to give up. But it was like not predetermined.
Yeah.
But however the situation works out, the situation works out.
It doesn't. You aren't broken to the point where you actually believe that you act this way, and so the police, like some type of mystical ghost-like power, will take you away from yourself.
Yeah.
It is. I do this, and then we'll see. Like I do this, and then this will occur.
Yeah, like Asada Shakur, she's sitting in prison. Then one day, they're like, "Come on, let's go."
Exactly, and that's what it needs to be. We need to have that situation where they do not control fate, or they cannot control ideas that fate is in their hands. That fate is something that is negotiated by both parties. And I think before colonial power and colonial ideology was so ubiquitous, at the moment of colonial encounter, everything was on the table. Now we have been trained into the belief that not everything is on the table. We kind of have to like do a two-step where we're always following them, if that. And that is, I think, what the Runaway and the Maroon and all these people have to offer. The not political strategy, but the inability to conceive of a situation where the colonizer owns the future and fate. To just not, it's not that they were just decolonize themselves from the belief. They just did not imagine a world where the evil were always going to be in power. And so your actions become very different. When you start believing that they are the state and they are godly, then you do what you can. It's a very different thing than I'm just going to do whatever.
And I love that. Stop assuming that the powers that be always have the upper hand.
Exactly.
So let's open up the conversation to everyone else.
What does interpolation mean?
The best way to direct you is to go through this, and I usually don't cite like actual people to just read this, whatever, but this literally is useful. It is Louis Althusser's ideology and the ideological apparatuses, and he goes through this way that the subject is formed through what he calls ideology. So it's ideology in a way that's used differently. And he actually says that this is a way of forming the subject. And all the diagnosis of how that's happening is true in that essay. But the lay way of thinking about it is that you are constituted by forces, almost literary forces around you. where that you are not yourself like a being independent of these little literary forces, that you are composed of them, composed of the ideas of race, of gender, of being a subject, of being an educated person. All these type of things are things that happen to your consciousness, and that is who you are, rather than you are a person that is existing in a street where ideas are kind of outside.
Some of it's a translation problem too. It was originally written in French, and so it's actually a combination word of inter plus appellation, just being a fancy way of saying like yourself. But we talk about like, God calling you to having a career or a life path or something like that. And he actually uses that case in that essay, saying that sometimes people like sit down and they feel like they're being called by God. He's like, well, let's actually dig into that. There's actually a process that's going on here. It's not completely mystifying. And sometimes a cop might be sort of calling you into existence in a moment. There's another scene that people don't talk about as much either, where he says that a friend comes and knocks on your door and says, hey, are you there? So it's like when people call out to you, it sort of makes you part of who you are. Maybe even a idea of yourself that you might not always anticipate. And so then some people have another version of this scene too, like Fanon has a really famous one, in which he's this guy who grows up in the Caribbean and he goes to France, and he's just walking down the street, and this white woman and her little girl just looks at him and says, "Oh, hey, you're a black guy." Actually, it's more complicated and much ruder than that. And he's like, at that moment, he's like, I'm not even me anymore. I'm just whoever they think that I am. So it's just as much about like passing and performing and how you appear to other people and sort of where that locks you in the social world. Does that make more sense?
A little bit more, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. I feel like you've dropped a few hints that you like poetry or that you used to like poetry. And I'm curious if you experience poetics at all in your current writing or your political life or your teaching life, or if you engage with poetry in any way, or is that on the back burner?
It's a whole life problem. So what I've now come to peace with in terms of poetry is that that one is protection, because what I believe is illegal. So to state it as precisely as other people can state their opinions, I'm putting myself into a vulnerable position. And so poetry kind of remixes that, because for some reason you can say things in poetry in ways that you can't say things in prose and say things plainly. Because they still haven't. This moment is a little different, but for a very long time they weren't even policing the poetry. So just let them have their poetics, but you can't say it. But you can rhyme it, but you can't say it.
Yeah.
So that is just general practicality for me. But also there is this conflict between classes of the educated class and the non-educated class. Educated in school through the system, etc. Where in order to be precise about a thing, to no fault of their own, they have to use words and phrases that carry the precision, but in as far as they become precise, they become inscrutable to the people that they might even be trying to serve. So language itself bends, and in order to carry the point and not just to be vague, in order to say not just say that law is bad, be specific about it. In trying to explain how law is bad, you become further and further away from the make it plain language of the people. But for me, what poetics allows is you can be precise through the meaning of the poem, and at the same time not be foreign to the people at the same time, which is how Black language and slang and all these things compensate for the weakness of standard English. And so the poetic allows me, because when I'm saying it in a way that will be read as poetic, I see that I meant things precise, and I can translate that into proper academic talk. But I wouldn't write that. I could translate it for a person who cannot understand poetics, and I could translate that and to kind of just diagnose exactly what I'm saying. But to be perfectly precise and to be able to still speak to people, I think for me, I found that what is poetic, which is just the being a little bit less exact with the inherited meanings of the words, and to kind of broaden it and move it around from that exactitude. That thing, that space, can still be molded into a type of directness that can both be understood and not lose its accuracy. But I used to write poems, and I don't anymore, and I worry about that. And I'm wondering if whether um, I've sublimated that idea to write poems into a type of poetic writing. And what does that mean? Because I also did like writing strictly poems, but I don't know what happens there myself. Savage story.
Yeah.
At one point, you Professor, used the phrase curtailing of the imagination, and my understanding was you were suggesting that that was being done through a certain kind of management of language. And a little later on, you used the phrase the apparatus of ideology. In this process of curtailment and in this apparatus, are those two things externally managed, or do those things just kind of happen like topsy, hopping out of nowhere?
What two things?
This apparatus of ideology, is it managed, or is it just something that happens of its own volition without any kind of steering?
Yeah. Again, this is close to the alpha surface, so that's why this is important. But there are two things that happen. One, there is a conspiracy of people who have come together to say a certain type of thing, a certain type of way, and they have the megaphones to be able to say it loudly. So they will say that we must all come together as a country. That phrase, you've heard it many times.
Yes.
So it's not just like an accident of speech. It's like some people are saying that we will say things now, or this is not. There's no place for racism in America. Everybody says it. Everybody keeps on saying these exact same phrases. There's no place for racism. So at some point, somebody has to have had the phrase, told other people to say it, or there was just a phrase that was so useful that other people just copied it and said it too. But so that is where I do believe that there are actually people who sit down and do public relations and manage ways of saying things to convey things that will arrest people's imagination. I do believe that is a thing that happens. I can see it in liberals who want to continuously have Black people join the American state, to say things, to plan their writing, to say it in such a way that people can be convinced to be associated with this state. So I know these people as people. So I'm sure they're doing it in media and other places as well. But after you say that there is no place for racism in America, that happens in the media or whatever, but it also happens in the family after that. So people just go up and voluntarily say that there's no place for these type of things in America. You can hear it on the street, things that were crafted in some lab somewhere. People will literally just say it normal. And so the ideological apparatus literally has been invented in certain realms of power and has now filtrated into the lumpen society or the working class society. And just because of the power of the school or because of the elite or the intelligentsia and all that, people believe that this is the thing that they're supposed to say. So they end up speaking to their children in ways that they've generally just plagiarized from power. So and sometimes it's spontaneously done. It's like people are not like really critical of why they say that. Like they see something happen on the road and they're like, well, there's no place for that racism in America. They're not planning that, but they just say it like that. And they say it because it is so powerful how they crafted things that it now just becomes a normal and natural thing to kind of just parrot power. So you will, and for me, I think that somebody at some point must have noticed this and has then been able to just sit down and craft things to say to ensure that people are just like Israel has the right to exist. How is that a thing? Because that doesn't happen anywhere else. You can't just say because there's a whole bunch of countries that do not have the right to exist. They don't exist anymore, or they could not exist. But you have that phrase, you package that phrase, you repeat that phrase, and you use that phrase as a cudgel in a number of different places. So that now, and in street debates or in schools or in things, people confronted with the existence of anti-colonial survival must have to now deal with this phrase that owes its power to the fact that it's repeated. That this phrase exists, and you have to now contend with this phrase as a natural truth that was crafted by someone who had the poetic ability to be able to phrase things in such a way that it has both the force of poetics and the force of ideological power, so that people can just naturally parrot it and then suffer under it.
But then what I'm thinking, because I think we spoke about this last year in class, is that I think why it's pervading so well, it's because people want to catch on those, like they need those tools. Because the number of times in my life where something racist happened to me and I say it to my white friend and they respond, oh no, it can't be.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because it's like rubbing you, like it's gonna ruin your imaginary, or because, and so you don't want to see it, it can't be, it can't exist, or is it because you're living in a world, in a system that is fitting you so well and you don't want me to come and like, yeah, both solutions overlap. But yeah, so in my mind, it's like, okay, there's the medias, but there's also like an internalized racism that people don't really look at, really, especially liberals, I think.
Yeah.
Way more dangerous.
Yes, but not only that. So what happens is that they started off racist, but they are also provided the tools to be able to rationalize and speak their racism. So in the George Floyd thing, they were happy that George Floyd was killed, or they just didn't care, whatever. But when they're confronted with people that said that they shouldn't have been killed, they are provided with the tool to say, I don't think that George Floyd should be your martyr. I heard that in Zanzibar, and I heard that in the streets of New York. I heard all these things in the streets of America. I heard all these things at the same time. The same phrase, that I don't think George Floyd should be your martyr. Well, where did that come from? Where is that? Why are you saying it that way? So the racist person who wanted George Floyd to die can now use what has been understood to be as a general cliche of this society and then say that I don't think George Floyd should be a martyr. And then you deploy that against other people who then this becomes in terms of the debate. So now whatever you say has to be contended with this other acknowledged thing, which is that George Floyd should not be your martyr. And you have all these other things. Like, okay, so now I want to say, hey, I don't like genocide. So now you have to contend with this idea, well, does Israel have the right to exist? Well, you have to, the only reason you have to contend with it, because somebody has invented, packaged, and made that into an actual, almost material tool, and you must now go back and again. Because it's not just like an idea between colonialism and anti-colonialism. It's an idea of thought versus this device. And these are the things that are contending. And it's only this device it has this power because people have now accepted that these people are allowed to be able to produce things, have things, and then make them their devices.
And I think some of the traditional tools in cultural studies that we sometimes rely on is like first, the Italian communist who was largely writing when he was imprisoned for his political activity. Antonio Gramsci writes that the people who control society, like power in society, also get to control what gets taken as common sense. Mm-hmm. And so to fight that society, you don't just have to take over the legislature or the politicians or whatever. You also need to confront the ways in which common sense is made and upend it in the process.
Yeah.
And then, Althusser is interesting because he offers this psychological dimension too as well. I mean, like the quote is like, ideology is the imaginary relation to your real material conditions of existence. And so it's like people misrecognize, they see themselves in these things that were manufactured for them as if they made them or came up with it themselves.
Yes.
And that's the problem, this misrecognition that these, assholes on TV are their job is to give us all these rationalizations and justifications and alibis, and that's just what they do. And then suddenly someone comes up the next morning and they're like debating with their friends and they repeat the same thing as if they came up with it and they feel so brilliant and they own it. And it's like, no, you don't possess it like that. It's just language. Of course, it was already there to begin with. And like, you need to be challenging that shit because it's not natural.
And with the multiplication of content, when I go back to France, I really picked up on that because I can see in November 1st, somebody popped up with an element of language, and maybe 5 months after, there's the cousin of my boyfriend-in-law, I don't know, who's saying the same thing. I'm doesn't really, do you know from where it comes from? Just decompose the sentence, you're gonna see people coming up oh, it's not technical genocide. It doesn't come from them. Do you know personally what is the characteristic of a genocide?
And it's manufactured the same way that clothing trends are,
It's just through language, another product. Same thing with woke. All of a sudden, I remember saying woke before woke was a bad thing, and now woke has been possessed and turned just by the same type of people who can say that. Okay, well now I can say anything, and they will say, well, this is a woke thing to say. And people that are just well-meaning regular people, it's oh, I don't want to be woke because they have this idea that has been, because we don't have the power to be able to own the ideological means of production. We can't, we tamper with it, we have slangs and ideas, but they own the power. So they possess woke, and now, which came from us, and we can't do anything about it. We just have to take it. We don't have the power to be able to overthrow it, because they say a thing, and they coordinated around it. They did the same thing with groomers. They were saying people were just groomers. Where does this come from? And then everybody started saying that these are trans groomers and they're grooming kids. And then people who are just transphobic in general were able to now have a device to be able to just use and then attack them. So and then attack trans people and everyone. So I think there is because Althusser says that ideology is the site of class struggle too. There is a way that, unlike a gun, you can negotiate where there is a type of battle that does exist. And I don't know exactly what is necessary to be able to kind of make it a thing, but it definitely seems to be extremely necessary, which is one of the reasons why I am not content to just to not say the colonial part. I have to say the colonial part because there's a whole bunch of leftists that will talk about revolution and destroy the entire society and all that. But if they do not say colonialism, they still can have the power of the state, of white supremacist power within it. And so it's not enough for me to be able to say, okay, well, we must be revolutionaries. You have to also say that the entire state is a colony, so that you do not have this safe space for colonialism within a left radical revolution. And so for me, to always mention colonialism or the colony or all these type of things does not permit for a type of revolutionary colonialism that is coming on the horizon. You always have to stick out the thing to say, okay, well, this is a colony, this is a settler, this is not just whatever, this is literally specifically a settler. So because there's always a push to be able to bulldoze over the that remark that this is colony, and to think of another peaceful revolutionary colonialism. And they do that because it's just so they'll say things, revolutionary, we need to have a revolution in America. No, there's no America.
And this is the brilliance of the Panthers, I think, because even at their height, maybe they had 10 or 20,000 members, but we still sort of think and talk with them because they understood that it doesn't just happen by trying to seize power in a building of already existing, influence like the state house in Sacramento and carrying the guns, but it's about transforming all the way people think and talk about the world around them. And so having the newspaper, super important. Drawing cops as pigs, calling them pigs, calling them fascists. Like these are things that still continue to reverberate today. And that, all the brilliant graphic design, of course it gets appropriated by Shepard Fairey for the Obama campaign and all these other things. But they even used to hand out copies of Mao's Little Red Book. And I'm certainly not a Maoist, but the brilliance of writing a political ideology in and through poetry meant to be read by everyday people. Like, come on.
Yeah. Because literally the Panthers were never in a situation where they could overthrow the state. They never had guns that could contest the U.S. Army. But they were a threat not because they had guns. They were a threat because they were seen to have guns. Because what they did was to create an international, let's even call it a national battle on the plane of ideology, so that their actual power was magnified thousandfold by the symbol of their power rather than their actual power. And so that's what was dangerous, because now you have opened up a space that was beyond what they can do with guns in kitchen tables and in garages and in backyards. There was another way of thinking about the world that was not American U.S. colonial dominance over Turtle Island, over the land. There was that existed, and that was in itself dangerous. That was what needs to be stepped down. So you can have you can squash and actually a little military force. They do this in bigger countries than the Panthers. It's easy. But what is harder to suppress is the moment that an anti-colonial idea exists in the world, because that spreads faster than the actual organizing of the Panthers themselves. The idea that you can have a place apart. The threat was not that the Maroons would actually throw over the state, but they were inspiring that people could be Maroons, people can be fugitives, people can be runaways. That was much more dangerous, and that's why the ideological power tends to be as important, or I would consider even more important than the repressive power, because it's not so much that you have to do things to this army, this world army, but you have to convince the people in the army that they are not soldiers. That is much more dangerous and that's much more effective than let's overthrow things.
And really briefly, I think something that's really brilliant about them that doesn't get talked about enough is the connections they're drawing with other radicals at the time, right? So with free Huey Newton events that are happening in Oakland, it's not just the Panthers. They're also having Stokely Carmichael. They're having H. Rap Brown. Angela Davis, who was never a Panther, only a Communist Party member, she's still in the mix, right? And then even James Baldwin is getting in on it and being part of speaking tours. Jean Genet, just some gay hustler from Paris, is coming in. It becomes a lot more just than one thing, and that's where it gets really dangerous. And the level of ideology, it's hard to miss.
What?
We have time for one or two questions.
Oh.
What is the association of pigs come from? Causing pigs?
Where did that come from? I don't know. They just was if I'm a fish in water, it's always just been pigs. So I don't know what the actual origin story is.
So it's visually done in the Black Panther newspaper. And so what's his name? The guy who did all the visual graphic design for it. Yeah, Emory Douglas might have been the person who, he's still around. He's in Oakland and he gives talks and stuff. There's also a fake FBI created Panther coloring book, which is actually really rad. It's really cool. You can look it up. It's out there. That has cops as pigs and stuff. And they thought it was going to be this counter propaganda campaign, but it was just over there. And I think the idea is if they're going to dehumanize us, we're going to dehumanize them, and that it's going to be effective.
There's no connection to Orwell. Was this also? Did they invent the pigs, or was this?
Everyone's always talking about pigs, right?
As police?
Well, I don't think the pigs in Animal Farm are police. They're Stalinists.
And yeah, it's interesting. this is getting a little bit. But yeah. So I have no idea where the picks come from. Like I think there's more to be done than just like calling the cops. Like there's much more to be done, but not just like the dehumanization of the police, but to undress the police, to take them out of their uniform, so that it's not so much like it's one thing to be able to say, okay, these are bad people, but it still like brings a type of collective force of the police. Where for me, I think to present the police as individuals and the uniform as not having a type of symbolic power, but it's just a fashion trend, then you have a very much more clear version of settler white supremacist individual values than because you want to take them out of the idea of the collective, because it's through the collective power that they're able to present themselves as a police and not just some random lynchers that find something.
Yeah, colonial authorities love draping themselves in medals and uniforms and
Yeah.
all this other shit.
And that's how they do it. It's the I am, we are one type of Navy type of thing. It is the military is the being. You're supposed to be depersonalized, and so you become powerful because you depersonalize.
I have one question. I'm not sure that this is a question quite yet, but I'm reflecting on like the power of ideology and common sense, and thinking about like I'm thinking about memes and how like memes have become an expression of internet culture, but have kind of in some ways created like real like IRL life culture, and thinking how memes kind of run on a fuel of irony and shock, and I'm wondering like, and that's kind of been utilized by the common sense power, and I'm wondering like, where does irony and shock, like how do you counter that, or how does the marooner employ irony and shock if like in some ways if memes are the way that common sense is being manufactured now, I guess. Like.
Yeah. So for me, like I'm less aware of how memes have been taken back over. It makes perfect sense. It seems that I'm sure that there are corporate memes and a whole bunch of people doing things like that. But it seems that it was originally this thing where you are combating ideological power through your own creative invention, which is the same thing that happens through slang and language and poetry and all these other things. That you can see the world, repackage it as a counter to the prevailing dominant discourse. And so for me, it's always still, and I'm probably just dated, but it still seems extremely useful to produce ideas that is separate and apart from the line that is told by the media in general.
Well, I agree. I think that memes are in some ways originated kind of as countercultural expression, but I think that countercultural expression at the time was very largely anti-Semitic and racist. Like if you think of like Pepe the Frog, and like it kind of originated in like the 4chan swamp, and I think that like that has kind of what was countercultural has now become in some ways the ruling power controlling narrative, and I think the reason why it's so effective to me is because it's employed irony and shock basically, and I think this is maybe a critique I think of leftist discourse, which is pretty much very allergic to irony. It tends to like really like root itself in earnest, and like this idea of like that there is a truer reality than the one that we're inhabiting. And I think that like that's not sticky in the world of memes. It's like it's actually like it's really deflated. And I think that's kind of, and you see like pundits use meme logic. Like Trump is pretty much really he employs meme logic really well, and because it's rooted in irony and shock.
I think a lot of this is just that the left has been captured by a business professional class in the United States, and so that's why you get some of the earnestness, because it's considered like brand toxic or something if it's not family friendly and straight to the point and that sort of thing. And that There are maybe some older generations who are very earnest or something like that. It's probably like the base of progressivism or something. It's probably like a boomer hippie sort of thing. I think at least the digital scenes that I'm a part of, they're just as many, if not more, and funnier leftist memes.
I mean, they are funny.
Yeah,
So
so
they
it's
don't
like,
catch in the same way.
so it's just like, Fanon read comic books, for instance. We talked about comic books. So I think that it's like popular forms should always be available. And I think one of the problems with even a left version of the left in the US is it's very professionalized and people become professional NGO workers, they become sort of career aspirational and that sort of thing. And so they stop doing dangerous stuff. Like things that are just like dangerous to themselves because they're invested in their own success in this very like narrow career sort of way.
Yeah.
And so until politics is disinvested from that, becomes a lot less professional, not attached to people's careers, then people will be able to start engaging in more risky behavior again. And then I think we'll see a lot more innovative and interesting forms of it.
Can I ask a question related to what you, it's for both of you, but related to what you said? Earlier we were talking about how you have to speak and work in a register of academic language to sort of gain that legitimate credibility to then be able to do the kind of batty, dangerous things that you want once you've like gotten your doctorate or so on. And I was wondering about why we don't critique education as an institution the same way that we critique slavery, settler colonialism, plantation, military industrial complex, and the police. All of those things you cannot reform your way out of, but it seems that for education and the church, the teachers and the preachers, we still want some to hold on to some version of it. And I was wondering why there's like a distinction between education.
For me, there's no distinction. There is no like reforming education. You are, as an educator in the first place, you're already towing some line. Even and like from the people that I know, I'm the least interested in the whole academic stuff, and I still assign essays. And this is just like almost a knee-jerk reflection. It's not even like considered. This is like a knee-jerk reflection. You must do the things that you're supposed to, even in like but I do believe that a lot of people who have ideas get fired in other places much more quickly. So you end up just going to the place where it's just a practical means of like survival. Like I can't get a job in other places, but I can get a job here easily. So I stay here, and you still have your ideas, but your inability to police your own verbalizing your ideas is not as punished as it is in other places. That's not to say that education as a sphere is actually more radical or useful. It's just that there's an accident in the system because it's not just like I dreamed to be an educator. I went around and I kept on getting fired. It just happens to be that this is the only place that I am much safer for at least a longer periods of time than I am in other places. It's just factually the case in this situation. And so, for some reason, they haven't come for education as they have come for like pretty much anything else, anywhere else, journalism or all these other things. They are now. Now it's like you're banning books and banning Black studies, so it's like it's eventually. But this was like one of the last holdouts. Not because of anything inherently useful about education, but just because I think at some point the West has justified itself by being thoughtful and rational and places of language and thinking. And so in their racism to prove that, they have valued this institution called the education system. And in doing that, in order to be able to kind of justify itself as the West, they have had to protect education and this appearance of free thought more than they had to do in like the police and stuff like that. And because they've done that, there are spaces for Black people and queer people who have never existed anywhere else safely to kind of congregate in this space because for a time they have, just because of their own shooting themselves in the foot, they have said that this is a place for freedom of thought in a way that they haven't said about like TV shows. So in this, where it's freedom of thought, all the people who can only but exist as free thinkers because otherwise it's death, find themselves gathered in this space.
The only good things about education have always been an attempt to compromise with radical protest. Like the first Black Studies programs were all created due to student protest. first one at SF State, one where I got my PhD. That's where they created the Young Studies and Black Studies programs. And then after they're created, they're always just trying to marginalize them more and more and that sort of thing. So like people have fought to create these like small niches that I think in the end we absolutely need to abolish along with all these other institutions. I think by and large, education is a class sorting mechanism and people can get relative amounts of power, you know, the more that you sort of climb into it, but especially at the more elite institutions, if you ever find yourself in it, you will see that you're just educating the people who are going to make a boatload of money at the end of the day. And so the nice part about being in an art school is like, at least people know that they're not in it just for the money. And so maybe they're in it for the ideas, maybe. To the extent in which they are, we can talk about ideas.
Yeah.
Sometimes we can talk about radical ideas. But like you said, it's more a bug than a feature because at the end, it's mostly to get people credentializations in order to get a sort of job, to get their sort of leg up in society.
Yeah, and then we have to conform or play the game to other like bodies of power that gives us legitimacy. We can't just think. We have to think and appeal our masters in whatever dark halls they're in. But at the same time, it is a bug. We can just continuously survive this place in a number of different ways. Like I can't be a farmer now. They will take your land and kill you. Basically, you can't be a farmer outside of that place. But I can do the exact same type of life-sustaining practices in education. Not because of education, but they just haven't come for the university as they've come for the farm. But they've come for it now.
I do have friends who've like totally dropped out and started farms and that sort of thing. Here's the thing. They usually last about 7 to 12 years. And it's really hard work.
It's really hard work.
It's really hard.
And they will come for you. They will come. Whatever you thought you were going to do was not, because there's a whole bunch of people that says, I'm just gonna like build a commune somewhere. But the thing is, like, the whole problem of colonialism is that we've had our communes, and that's what happened. They took our communes over and they colonized. So this imagining a place other kind of underestimates the total reach of colonial power.
So one thing that I write about in one of my first books is that I think that we all need to live double lives. By that, I mean that like your work is not your whole existence. And in fact, maybe it's only a limited amount of your existence if you can do it right. And then you have everything else that you do with your life. And the coincidence you build between those two things in part defines the politics of your way of life. And so everyone's going to have some sort of compromise with this sort of like messy world that we live in. But hopefully you all can find the right compromise between the things that you're sort of forced to do and what you do with all your other time and energy outside of it. I think a lot of people lie to themselves about sort of like how that coincidence is made, right? You know, there are a lot of people who are like, oh, I'm gonna make a bunch of money and then I'm gonna like donate that money or like use my services or whatever. Hopefully we're not doing too much harm by doing that as teachers. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I want to, because it'll be a very sad day when I start believing in the revolutionary power of education. Because that means I would definitely be God.
I have a friend who told me that I should kneecap him if he ever says that.
So then you're hanging out with right other people. But,
So for you, it's like, would your double life be sort of the maroon and the representation of the maroon? Like you were saying.
No, I'm a maroon and they just haven't fired me yet. So I'm just continuously here. I don't know why. It's just there's a number of different things that I do to compensate for my political beliefs. But
you're still making more essays though.
Huh? Yeah, that's it. Maybe that's what I'm doing. Maybe that's what I get. I force them to do essays. But I literally
read articles.
Yeah, but you know, there's a way of people. There's the professor who writes about maroons, and there's the maroons who happens to be a professor. And I've never been comfortable with being a professor that's writing a history of the maroons. I am doing what I need to do to live. And if that is a telemarketer or a professor, or I've been in all these type of places. They fired me many times as a telemarketer. They haven't fired me yet as a professor. So I just put 2 to 2 together. Like, this is safer than everywhere else.
It's a great place to end.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that Abby couldn't be here. I would have been dope. All right. This is our last class too. So later.
Wow.